Last general lecture I did say, we may be dealing with tough topics. And I'll be frank with you, all of the general lectures coming up, other than the finance ones, probably will be tough topics in a way. Please sit, listen, absorb the knowledge. Try not to talk. Elliot will be filming himself taking this presentation. So just be mindful of the background noise that you are creating when sometimes you whisper to each other, because that will transfer into his video that he needs to use. Okay? He will be asking questions, so please don't be afraid to put your hand up and answer them, or vice versa at the end, there'll be questions. But I'm going to hand over to Elliot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. How's everyone doing? Good? Good to hear. All right, very good. Black History Month. Right, let's clear up a bit of a misconception. Anyone heard of the brand FUBU? FUBU stands for us, by us. So FUBU, for us, by us, clothing brand. Black History Month is the same. It was created for us, by black people. So W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP in America first started off Black History Month in the mid-1800s. Later down the line, especially when my family came here from the West Indies, from Jamaica, we decided, or our people decided, that we needed to balance the education that the children in our communities were being given. So they decided to start teaching Black history to our peoples, to our community in October. Why? Because you've just come off of school holidays, so you should be fresh-minded and enthusiastic about learning about it. So created for us, by us. Now, why is it important? I'm going to show you. Can you just go to the next slide, please? So although I'll be put in, especially in Britain, classed as black, this is my genetic history. This is my lineage. Gave some DNA to Ancestry.co.uk and they came back with everywhere on the planet in the past 1,000 years that I'm descendant of, to some degree of accuracy. So the reason why it's important to talk about black history is because black history is world history, it's British history. I'll explain. Let's tell a bit of a story that you guys are probably aware of. You guys are aware of the Viking invasion of Britain? Yeah? Alright, so that's why you see the orange and the blue at the top, the Scandinavian countries. That's why you see my genetic lineage from there. Obviously you've got Scottish, and then you've got English, and especially Cornwall, which is obviously relevant to my history, being of Jamaican descent. You've then got Germany and France. So without Germany and France, our language would probably sound quite different. The setup of our monarchy would probably be quite different, because you've probably heard of the Norman invasion of 1066. Yeah, all right, very good. Now, so underneath that, we then go to Africa. So you look at West Africa, we've got Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon, Benin, Mali. Does anyone know why those areas are very important when it comes to British history? Any idea? Say that again. So? Slavery, yeah. But before that, I'll give you an idea. So, everyone knows about Oxford University? Yeah, okay. Oxford University, the Dale of Morley, travelled to what would have been southern Spain in the medieval era. At that time, it was occupied by an African empire called the Moors. They were extremely academic. Many of their recruits and many of their people came from today Senegal. They're extremely academically minded. Dale of Morley travelled to Spain, which was under the occupation of the Moors, to study in these Arabic institutions, Arabic-speaking institutions. He then came back to England, inspired by their academic ability, and set up educational establishments in Oxford. Today is Oxford University. Many of us have just gone through, many of us have had a COVID vaccine. There was a gentleman who was later called Onesimus, who comes from West Africa. He was unfortunately taken as a slave to the Americas. His slave owner was very puzzled and frustrated by the amount of people who were dying from smallpox. Onesimus shared with his master that in West Africa, we would cut open the wound of someone, or cut open the boil of someone suffering from smallpox. We would then take the pus and we would apply it into one of our open wounds, and we found after that we didn't suffer from smallpox. What does that sound like? Vaccine. It sounds like a vaccine, exactly that. If we look to Mali and Benin, which would be in that pink area there, who's heard of Timbuktu? All right, very good. So just like Oxford and Cambridge today, In the medieval era, Timbuktu, which is situated in Mali and Benin, was under the construction of the Empire of Songhai in the medieval era. That was one of the main educational establishments of the world. There were more people studying in Timbuktu at that time than the entire population of London. So what we're seeing here is how empires and people go through fluxes and triumphs and tribulations. The most important thing that we're going to talk about today is how our history in Britain and contributions to Britain are a multicultural effort. Even if we were to look further east, you'll see India. Our numerical system that we use, the reason why we don't use Roman numerals anymore is because the Indian numerical system of 0 to 9 made their way into England, or into Europe via the Moors. If we look further east to China, the reason why we're not using sundials anymore is because someone was able in China to create a mechanical system to tell the passage of time. And then even if we look to North and Northeast Africa, we see the origin of many of our myths and many of our religions as well. All right, so let's continue. Next slide, please. And the slide after that as well, please. All right, so we're all going to go through a little bit of an exercise together, because the thing is that we're talking about African history. We are all technically African. We come from we're an African species, originated in North Africa. So what we're going to do today is we're going to explore why we are so different from our primate cousins and why we are so different from Neanderthals. Now, to do this, should be a bit of an interesting experiment. I want everyone to close their eyes for me, please. And I want you to take 5 long breaths in and out. Fully relax. In. Out. Fully relax. Concentrate. In. Out. And fully relax. Okay, we'll do it for 3 breaths. Right, keep your eyes closed, please. Now, I want you to use your wildest imagination. I want you to think 5, maybe 10 years in the future. What kind of future do you want? Where do you want to be? Who do you want to be friends with? What do you want to be able to do? Where do you want to live? All of these things. Dream as high and as mighty as you can. Meditate on that thought. Try and make it as visual as possible, as real as possible. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a question. What does it take of you to get there? What skills do you have to have? What actions do you have to partake in? What skills do you have to learn? What do you have to focus on? And open your eyes, please. Would anyone like to share with me what they were envisioning? Anyone? If not, I'll share mine. Okay, cool. So, in my mind, I have a vision of, I'm an osteopath as well, I own a clinic. I have a vision of how successful I want my clinic to be. I have a vision of the relationship that I want to have with my wife, with my future children, the places that I want to go. Now, I then ask the question, what does it take of me to get there? Well, I know I need to focus every day, hard work, discipline, dedication. I need to become better educated every day, learn new skills. I need to make sure that my routine is solid. Now, this is what makes us amazing as human beings, is we have the ability to look into our own minds. Other animals don't, unfortunately, have this ability. They rely more on instincts. So if they're stimulated by chemicals or a sight, they'll go left. Something else, they'll go right. We have the ability to look into our own minds and decide what we should be focusing on and where we want to be. Some of us have that ability more than others. Some of us tend to switch off a little bit, get distracted easily. But if we can master this mindfulness, or if we can master this ability of consciousness, it can take us quite far in life. Next slide, please. Now, some of the first people to document this were the ancient Egyptians. So you have King Narmer, who in around 5,600 BC, according to the Julius Africanus chronology, he left the Sudan as the climate was starting to change. We know that we're going through climate change at the moment. I'm sure a lot of you guys are very concerned about it. What was happening around this time is a few thousand years earlier, the climate had started to stabilize. That means that floods and seasons could be more predictable. So King Narmer from the Sudan comes into Egypt, and he sees that the Nile is starting to contract and the Sahara Desert is starting to expand. What this means is that he can then start to take the Nile and irrigate land either side of the Nile, so you can have big booms in harvests, store it, celebrate, and continue year after year. Now, interestingly, in a book called The Dawn of Everything, it's a fantastic book, but it's quite heavy. The book looks into how important women were into the cultivation of land. And it turns out that their hypothesis is that because of the natural creative traits that many women have, and some men are lucky enough to share, the interest in nature and controlling nature and trying to optimize nature led way to early farming. And without farming, you have to keep moving. With farming, you can stay put, you can settle, and you can start to develop interesting ideas. Next slide, please. Now, once again, what this enabled the ancient Egyptians to do is start to personify their environment. And you might say that religion is almost a personification of our environment. It's our way of looking within us and looking outside of us and trying to come up with theories and ideas of how they match. Now, one of the ways that the Egyptians did this is via their myths. And the myths gave them meaning for life and meaning for different things that they were doing on a regular basis. I'll give you a summary. Tell me if this sounds familiar to you. So we have on the far right, we have Queen Isis. Isis, queen, woman, represented creativity, fertility, but also the abundance for all and the possibility for all things. If you then go to the left, you see Osiris. He's the old god, or the king of the old world, represents order, structure, culture, etc. Now he had a fight and disagreement with his brother Set, who's just to the left-hand side of him. They fell out. Set decides to carve Osiris up into 1,000 pieces and spread him throughout Egypt. Isis, understandably his wife, is very upset. She decides to cast a spell and impregnate herself with Osiris. She then gives birth to Horus, born without a father, so you could call it a virgin birth. And he represents truth, foresight, and also the new. He comes and he goes down into the underworld to rescue his father, and he battles Set every night. And the reason why he battles Set every night is because evil, which was called Isfet in ancient Egypt, the evil never dies. Good always has to fight against evil. So that's their exercise and their way of seeing into themselves each day, that they need to balance the evil within them and the evil outside of them. So, next slide, please, and then the slide after that. So, and then if you click again, then it should, perfect, okay. So this, that's it, thank you. So this was taken from my recent trip to Egypt. Now, one thing that I've found incredible about the ancient Egyptians, right, is that in, say, modern day, we've got this dichotomy between science and religion, or science and creativity. Now, for the ancient Egyptians, it all went in the same line. All right, I'll draw your attention to this. So, you'll see in the middle, we've got Ramses II, who's seen as being the most productive architect in ancient Egypt. And he built what is now called today, on the left-hand side, Abu Simbel. Now, Abu Simbel, you'll see 4 huge statues of Ramses II. About 200 meters to the right, there's also a replica on a smaller level to his queen, to his wife. Now, check this out. So, merging architecture, science, myth, creativity. You see the small doorway in between the 2 large statues of Ramses II. You see that? All right. So, Ramses was, I think he was born in October and coronated in February on certain days. Now, on the day of his coronation and the day of his birth, only on those 2 days, the sun goes straight through that doorway and illuminates an end room in the depth, the deepest temple, or the deepest shrine in Abu Simbel, and it lights it up, but it only lights up 3 of the 4 gods in that room. It lights up Osiris, Ramses, who narcissistically put himself there. So Ramses, Osiris, Isis, but there's one more god, the god of darkness. That is the only god that's not illuminated, left in the dark. So that means that you're looking at about 4,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians were able to create colossal structures, huge structures. They weren't able to wait to see whether the sun hit that point. They had to know whether it was, they had to know that it was going to very specifically hit that point. And they were able to replicate, and that still happens year on year on year. Unfortunately, the Abu Simbel was moved at a later date. But we see the same amazing construction in the Temple of Karnak, which you see on the right-hand side, and also the pyramids, which are on the bottom left-hand side. I'll tell you something else before we move on. So there's a lot of mystery about why the pyramids were first built, right? Now these things are huge, about 400 foot tall. Today, it's 400 foot or 400 meters, I think it's 400 foot tall. Today, they can't replicate the accuracy of these structures. They correlate to true north. Some people would argue that they correlate also to the circumference of the Earth, the distance between the Earth and the Sun. But check this out. So there was an architect who was excavating the pyramids, and there was a bin in the middle of the pyramid, and he asked the other archaeologists why there was a bin there. And they said, we just take animals and we put them in there if they're dead, if they crawl into the pyramids. He said, why doesn't the bin smell? And he said, I don't know. So they started to take out these animals from this bin, and they found that just being in the pyramid, the animals were slowly being mummified, just from being in the pyramid. They then replicated the experiment, and they took some bacteria, they took food, and they put them in pyramidal shapes. And they found that the time before they died or went off was doubled. So it might be that the pyramids were built purely to lengthen the amount of time that the mummies were going to stay in good condition for. So I just want you to skip ahead 3 slides for me, please. I want to know, thank you, I want to know from you who inspires you, who you think is amazing. Could be your mum, could be your dad, could be sports stars, could be singers, artists, businessmen, anyone. Anyone got any suggestions for me as to who's inspirational to you? Could be a TikTok star, YouTuber, you name it. No? I heard something. Say it again, please.
Billie Eilish.
Billie Eilish, thank you. Can you tell me why Billie Eilish? Yeah?
I don't know, music.
Yeah, do you think she's impressive?
Yeah.
Amazing, all right. Now, do you feel like Billie Eilish influences you in the sense that because you're inspired by her, you want to do more for yourself?
I don't want to be her.
But do you think that she changes how you behave on a day-to-day, how you think?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah? So for me, when I was growing up, I don't know if you guys have heard of it, my idol was Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, the greatest of all time. He was able to not just beat every man on the planet, but he was also even able to stand up to the American government when they decided to invade Vietnam. I thought he was ethically, in most areas of his life, a great man, but also athletically a great man. Now what we have here are ancient versions of what we might call role models. They're deities. They are people who actually existed, arguably actually existed, and their legend then continued after them until they became deities or gods. So at the top, for example, we've got Oshun. Oshun is a Yoruba deity representing water, purity, love, humanity. If you guys are Beyonce fans, you might see that Beyonce has emulated Oshun in some of her dress and some of her fashion. We've then got Ogun, who is another Yoruba god of justice, war, community, truth. There's a famous story about a man called Toussaint Louverture, who was a Haitian of African descent. This is an African freedom fighter, one of the most successful freedom fighters of all time. And he used to channel the spirit of Ogun, or the image of Ogun, into himself before he went into battle. And then we then have Horus, who we've already covered, and Imhotep. All these individuals set up standards for ourselves. And it's the same for us, you know, like for me, if I didn't have Muhammad Ali, and if I didn't have a role model to look up for, I might not be able to achieve or look into myself and find the promise or the ability that I have found today. And that is also partly why it's so important that we talk about the history of others and the history of individuals who look like ourselves, who feel like ourselves, because it will give us something to step into. All right, next slide, please. So now we're going to move to West Africa. Now, during the medieval era, so we see the collapse of the Roman Empire in about the 5th century AD, and collapsing of the Roman Empire and the generals and lieutenants leaving England and Western Europe, you might think of it as what happens when your teacher leaves the room. right? So everyone's out for themselves, everyone goes a bit crazy. So in Western Europe there was widespread famine, disease, violence, even incidents of cannibalism. However, in West Africa at the time, West Africa was going through a bit of a golden age. You had the emergence of Songhai, you had the Yoruba and ancient Ghanaian tribes forming, establishing very successful trade links throughout Africa. And there seems to have also been trade between West Africa, North Africa, and the Americas. There is a Yoruba queen who in the 11th century AD was paving all of her streets. But she didn't just pave her streets, she decorated them with corn. So she would take corn and she'd roll it over the cobbled streets to start to get a pattern forming in them. Where does corn come from? America. How did she get it? Well, it seems that she would have got hold of corn a few hundred years before Christopher Columbus even tried to set sail to the New World. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. Next slide, please. Now, one of the most successful empires in West Africa was the Songhai Empire. So this was partly where my ancestry would have come from. You have a man called Mansa Abu Bukhari. Mansa Abu Bukhari was sitting on almost the most gold that the world had ever seen under the command of one man. Being a bit adventurous, he decides to take 2,000 ships. He sets sail west, and he's never seen again. Later, when Christopher Columbus goes to the Americas, they start to find African spears, African coins, and they also find names of ports like Mandinga Port, which descend from African names. So there is a hypothesis with evidence that West Africans were able to successfully sail to the New World, now to the Americas. Now, when Mansa Abu Bukhari left, he had to leave someone in charge, and that was his son, Mansa Musa. Has anyone heard of Mansa Musa before? All right, who's Mansa Musa? What does everyone know about him? Yeah? Yeah? Do you know what that journey is? It was. Sorry, has anyone heard of Hajj? Do you know what Hajj is? Muslim pilgrimage. Yeah, exactly that. So, Mansa Musa was sitting on a tremendous amount of gold, which he then reinvested into middle classes, and he also, so to create a middle class, so to reduce, you could say, class divide, but he also invested in educational establishments such as Timbuktu, which, like I mentioned before, was educating more people per year than the entire population of London. It was an international establishment for education. Mansa Musa decided to go on Hajj. Hajj is something that many Muslim leaders and Muslims, my friends included, go to at least once in their life. Whilst he went there, it was documented by other African tribes that it was like a city of gold travelling through the desert. Even his, what would you call it? Even his entourage were carrying huge golden orbs throughout the desert. And he spent so much gold that he crashed the economy in Egypt. Does anyone know why spending loads of gold might crash an economy? Does anyone know what that's called? Yeah.
Because it reduces the value.
Yeah. Do you know what that's called? Something that's been on the news the past few years.
Inflation?
Exactly that. If you flood an area with an excess of supply, then you're going to cause, or would that be called inflation or deflation? You spend too much, therefore the value of it goes down. I think that would actually might be called deflation. But I'm not an economist. Anyway, so he spent so much gold that he crashed the gold economy in Egypt. Now this is mirrored by what happened to the Spanish when they went to the New World. The Spanish brought so much gold back to Spain that they crashed their own economy. That's where the Rothschild Bank comes in for the history of Britain, because the Rothschilds, being, especially I think it was Nathaniel Rothschild, was a mathematical genius, and he was able to control inflation and deflation, regardless of the amount of gold that came into Britain, so he didn't suffer from the same thing. Anyway, back to Mansa Musa. So, Mansa Musa is the wealthiest man to have ever lived. And once again, he invested in middle classes, invested in the infrastructure of West Africa at that time. Next slide, please. And then next slide again. All right, so shortly after the rise of Mansa Musa, we start to see a crash or a fragmentation of West Africa, and that's partly because of infighting. It was later added insult to injury by Queen Elizabeth I and the Sultan of Morocco, travelling to West Africa, to Songhai, and collapsing it and raiding it and bringing more wealth back into Western Europe. But if we go back just to 7th, I'm going to speed through this. If we wrap up to, so if we go back to the 7th century AD, we see the Prophet Muhammad, who arises in Medina, in the Middle East. And he tells his followers to seek knowledge and to not fight other Muslims. So that's where we start to see a stop of the infighting of the Arabs, and they then start to spread westwardly towards North Africa. They absorb all of the knowledge from the libraries of Alexandria. They translate it into Arabic, they annotate it, they work through it, especially the Greek classics, and they even take the Bible and translate that into Arabic as well. Now, what I want you to think about is what all of these words have in common. All right, so algebra, alchemy, algorithm. Any similarities? Al. Where does the prefix al come from? Arabic, thank you. So a lot of these words that come into our language are Arabic. And then we see, once again, the Indian numerical system come into North Africa via these people who are now called the Moors, a mixture of Arabs, Berbers, and some West Africans as well. We start to see a huge introduction, so next slide please, of many things that we recognise today. You might see on the top left-hand side we have chess. One of my favourites is how the Moors influenced our music. So, I'm going to put some people on the spot here, no pressure. Does anyone know any prayers from the Quran? Any prayers from the Quran? No one? Okay. So, do you? Yeah. Okay, no pressure. No pressure. Would you mind reciting one?
Which one?
Any. So you can just do the first 3 lines if you want, or the first 4 lines. Yeah, cool. All right, thank you so much. So when you hear a Quranic prayer, what you might hear, which is quite common to all of them, is a rhythm. Is that fair? That the Quran has a rhythm to it and that prayers have a rhythm?
Yes.
Thank you. So that's where we start to see end rhyme coming in. So, end rhyme. That the last 2 words of the sentence have to sound the same in a poem. Simple as that, right? But this wasn't very well known in Europe. It wasn't commonly practiced. But when the Moors invaded Spain, and Spain was under Muslim, African, Arabic rule for about 1,000 years, we start to see end rhyme come in. End rhyme then travels throughout Europe by the troubadours, who are basically, they perform love poems and love songs. They start to use end rhyme. In West Africa at the time, I take it you guys have heard of the blues? So rhythm and blues? All right, perfect. So that beat comes from West Africa. West Africa, their culture travels to the Americas. We then have European culture travelling to the Americas. Both are using end rhyme, because about 30% of West Africans that travel to the Americas, including my ancestors, were Muslim. We get a combination of the blues, and we get end rhyme, and that's where we start to see rhythm and blues, hip hop, later grime, MCing. All of these things come from the interaction of cultures. Now, unfortunately, next slide please, the Moors, they started to spend excessively on academia, culture, and all these kind of things. It left them vulnerable. That's when we get the Spanish Conquista or Reconquista, and Spanish Reconquista, where the Visigoths start to take over southern Spain for themselves. That's when southern Spain starts to become Christian again. If you wanted to see the legacy of the Moors, one of the best places to visit in Spain would be Seville or Al-Andalus. And next slide, please. And like I said, this was later. We then start to see as the Moors and the Sephardic Jews were pushed into Morocco. We then have the Sultan of Morocco on the right-hand side at the time, and Queen Elizabeth I later down the line, then teaming up to sack Songhai. Songhai is what we spoke about before. All right, so I'm going to start to wrap it up now because I want to make sure that we've got time for questions. For me, that is the most interesting part of African history. It's the glory and the contributions to world history. But what has also been a huge contribution is to liberalism. The idea that every man is equal, every man has a right, and not just that. If you take a man's rights away, you better be prepared to fight because we're going to want it back. That's where we start to see the fight for freedom. Next slide, please. So long story short, we have the sacking of Songhai and later the, let's say, the adventures of Christopher Columbus, who sailed to the Americas. And I'm not going to say that he discovered it, but we'll say that he discovered the Americas for Western Europe. He writes letters back to Western Europe saying that this is very arable, fertile land, but it needs slaves to farm it. We then start to see a rise of empire jealousy. The Spanish start to raid West Africa, and they start to take Africans to the Americas to farm the plantations. The British then become quite jealous, also because of the amount of gold that the Spanish are bringing back to Europe. The British sail to the Americas to try, or the English especially, trying to find gold for themselves, and they can't find it. So what do? They decide to engage in piracy, and they start to raid the Spanish ships on the return from the Americas to England. Those pirates, for example, John Hawkins or Captain Morgan, the Welshman you might recognise from the front of bottles of rum, they come back to the UK. The Crown then taxes them and legalises what they're doing. So they're no longer pirates, they become privateers. And these privateers then start to form, later down the line, the British Navy. Now, next slide, please. This is where my ancestors would have been taken from West Africa to the New World. So not just raiding African towns, they would have also created an arms race. So for example, say me and you don't like each other, right? But I'm a little bit weaker than you. Now, you sell me guns. And you say that, in fact, you don't sell me guns, you say to me that you can have these guns as long as you bring me back people from your tribe. So that I then decimate your tribe, but then you come along and you then say to you that, I know that you're a little bit weaker at the moment, don't worry, here's some guns. If you raid my tribe, so if you raid my tribe and take more people, then that will balance the odds and then we'll do it again, right? So we start to see an arms race happening in West Africa. One of the mistakes was that many of these West Africans who were taken were obviously quite war-hardy guerrilla fighters who were ready to put up a fight because they're prisoners of war, right? That's where we start to see the ancestors, sorry, next slide please, of individuals, next slide please, individuals like Séné Feller and Toussaint Louverture. So Toussaint Louverture was descended from an Akan, so I think it's Akan, which would be modern day Ghana. He was descendant of a chieftain. He was descendant of someone who is knowledgeable about African warfare, about skirmishing, about being able to creep up on someone rather than fight in formation. These secrets of warfare travelled throughout the Caribbean. These people were able to put the fear of God into the English and the French, so much so that the English in Jamaica during the fight of the Maroons under Queen Nanny were riding back to back, which meant that you'd have two people on a horse, one person riding, the other person back to back with that individual, holding a rifle, just making sure that they had 360 vision to make sure they weren't going to be crept up in the middle of the night. And on average, they were sleeping about 2 hours a night because they were too scared of sleeping because of what these individuals, once they broke through, were able to commit to the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to start a massive fight for freedom throughout the West Indies. Next slide, please. And next slide again. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Toussaint Louverture. So Toussaint Louverture started an army, very, very well organised army in Haiti, which is the West Indies. Haiti is northeast of Jamaica. So he was able to recruit, I think about 300,000, not just men, but men and women. So about 100,000 of his army were women, like I said about Senate Belair in the previous slide. He slept about 4 hours a night. He would write up to 150 letters a day. He was extremely intelligent. He would write letters in English, French, and Spanish. He would sometimes be narrating to about 6 different secretaries at the same time to speed up the amount of letters that he could put out. And he's known as being one of the most strategic minds that has ever lived, especially in warfare. He defeated Napoleon Bonaparte, the French armies, Spanish and the English. And it's rumoured that on Napoleon Bonaparte's deathbed, he said, I should not have second guessed, I should not have betrayed Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture was eventually kidnapped, despite him wanting to team up with or ally with the French as long as they got their freedom. But he was banished to a tower which is east of France today. And those regrets by Napoleon Bonaparte were written or mentioned after his exile to St. Helena after the Battle of Waterloo. Next slide, please. Next slide again. Next slide. Next slide. All right, so next slide again, please. Perfect. All right, thank you. So, what this did is it set off a domino effect of liberalism. People wanted their rights, and they wanted it now, not just in the West Indies, but also in Western Europe as well. Samuel Sharp, so there's a place called Sam Sharp Square in northern Jamaica, Montego Bay, and there's a monument there dedicated to the Baptist War, and I have about 5 family names on that monument. And what these family members did is they answered the call by Samuel Sharp, who was a Baptist minister, who in 1831 started a revolt against the British. And he was able to inspire 60,000 Africans in Jamaica to fight against the British. Slavery was then abolished the year after. However, next to the names of my family members on that monument, you have their punishments. 500 lashes to the back, death, life of imprisonment, life of slavery. Now, these 500 lashes, they weren't by any normal whip. Has anyone heard of a cat of 9 tails before? What's a cat of 9 tails? Yeah?
It's a type of whip where it's got 9 different pieces of rope, so that it kind of like lashes in like strings.
Yeah. So what's 9 times 500? 9 times 500. 4,500, yeah? So those 500 lashes are actually 4,500 lashes to someone's back. Turn your back into a bloody sponge. Now, the impressiveness about these individuals is they didn't fight for themselves. There's no way they could do. They knew that they were going to die. They knew that they were likely going to get captured. They fought for individuals like myself and individuals like you, people who are going to come after them. Just like Martin Luther King says, I might not make it to the promised land. Very biblical in his messages. He's saying that these fights that were made by these early revolutionaries were so we could enjoy the world for what it is today. And the vision of today wasn't a divided one. In fact, in Haiti, after the Haitian Revolution, everyone was classed as black. Whether you're French, whether you're Polish, you're black now. Because you're an honorary black. You're on our country, you're classed as black. And I hope that, this history, it echoes throughout time, right? I was very interested in learning about this history because it inspired me. It inspired me as to what people could do. And when you read the works of individuals like what Queen Anne has done, what Harriet Tubman did, what Toussaint Louverture, Senate Belair, and these individuals, they fought for a vision of unity, where all of us have come around the table with our differences and we're not taking from each other, we're giving to each other, we give our culture, open to each other's culture. Now, we're a bit stuck for time today, so I'm going to cut the presentation today short. I wanted to cover mainly the Golden Age and up to the fight for freedom, but I hope that's educated you somewhat on some of the more in-depth history of African history besides slavery. There's a lot more than that. And obviously, if you've got any questions, please, it'll be my pleasure to answer them. Thank you so much.